keeps them coming back." John's jaw tightened, his calm exterior masking the storm within. He took a step closer to Richard, his voice steady but laced with quiet authority. "Exclusivity is one thing," John said, his tone cutting through the soft jazz playing in the background. "But discrimination under the guise of maintaining an image is another entirely. Tell me, Richard, how do you decide who deserves to be here? Is it based on the car they drive? The clothes they wear? Or perhaps—" John paused for effect, his gaze unwavering, "the color of their skin?" Richard's face flushed, whether from embarrassment or anger, it was hard to tell. His lips parted as if to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. John continued, leaning slightly forward now. "You see, I've built this brand not just on luxury, but on values, integrity, inclusivity, respect. If those principles aren't being upheld in every store that bears my name, then we have a problem. A big one." Richard stammered, clearly flustered. I wasn't aware." "That's exactly the issue," John interrupted, his voice firm. "You weren't aware. And neither were your assumptions about me when I walked in here today. But let me make something crystal clear, I am John Bennett, the owner of this company. This store, these watches, these coats, they're mine. Every single sale made here reflects directly on me and my vision. And what I saw today doesn't align with that vision." The room seemed to grow quieter, the other shoppers fading into the periphery as all eyes turned toward the confrontation. Richard's shoulders slumped, his earlier arrogance replaced by unease. "I didn't recognize you," Richard muttered weakly, glancing at the floor. "I would never have spoken that way if I'd known." John shook his head, disappointment etched across his features. "That's precisely why this matters. You shouldn't need to recognize someone to treat them with basic decency and respect. Everyone who walks through that door deserves the same level of service, regardless of how they look or what you assume about them. That's non-negotiable." With that, John straightened up, smoothing the front of his jacket. He looked around the store, taking in the polished marble floors and elegant displays once more before fixing Richard with a final, piercing stare. "Tomorrow morning," John said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you'll meet me at headquarters. We're going to discuss how we can ensure this kind of behavior doesn't happen again, not just here, but in any of my stores. Consider this your only warning." Without waiting for a response, John turned on his heel and strode toward the exit. As the heavy glass door swung shut behind him, the soft chime rang out, echoing faintly in the stillness. Outside, the crisp autumn air greeted him like a breath of clarity. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the number he needed. It was time to call a meeting, not just with Richard, but with every franchise owner across the country. What had happened today wasn't isolated, it was symptomatic of a broader issue that needed addressing. As John walked down Fifth Avenue, blending back into the crowd, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His wealth and success gave him power, but it also gave him responsibility, to lead not just with ambition, but with integrity. And he intended to do just that. "You tell me how long it typically takes to have something like this customized?" He kept his tone casual but watched the associate closely, noting her discomfort as Richard's gaze lingered on them. The associate hesitated again, glancing nervously toward Richard before answering. "Customizations usually take about 4 to 6 weeks, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But, it depends on the request." John gave her a reassuring smile, though his mind was racing. The atmosphere in the store felt oppressive, charged with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to emanate directly from Richard. It was clear now, this wasn't just about him. Richard's behavior had permeated the entire staff, creating an environment where customers were judged not by their interest or intent but by superficial appearances. "Thank you," John said warmly, leaning slightly closer to lower his voice. "You've been very helpful." He wanted to put her at ease, to let her know he understood the pressure she was under. Her slight nod and fleeting look of gratitude told him everything he needed to know. As the associate stepped away, John turned his attention back to Richard, who was still watching him intently. There was no mistaking the disapproval in Richard's expression, a smug certainty that John didn't belong here, that he wouldn't dare challenge the status quo. But John wasn't just another customer anymore. He was done observing. It was time to act. With deliberate calm, John approached the counter where Richard stood. The older man's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Back so soon?" Richard asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "I hope you're not planning to waste anyone else's time today." John met his gaze evenly, his jaw tightening for a moment before he spoke. "Actually," he began, his voice steady and commanding, "I'm here to discuss some concerns I have about the way this store operates." Richard blinked, caught off guard for the first time. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. "Concerns?" he repeated, his tone sharper now. "I can assure you, sir, we uphold the highest standards of service and integrity here." John leaned forward slightly, his piercing stare locking onto Richard's. "Do you? Because what I've seen so far suggests otherwise." "Tell me, Richard, how do you define integrity? Is it dismissing potential customers based on how they're dressed? Or is it instructing your staff to treat people differently depending on whether they meet your arbitrary standards?" Richard's face flushed red, his composure cracking under the weight of John's words. "I don't know who you think you are," he snapped, his voice rising slightly, "but I won't tolerate accusations like that." John straightened, his expression cool and unyielding. "You're right," he said smoothly. "You don't know who I am. Allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is John Bennett, and I own this store." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, his earlier arrogance evaporating instantly. Around them, the few remaining customers paused mid-browse, sensing the shift in power dynamics. Even Sarah, the assistant manager, froze in place, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. John continued, his voice carrying just enough authority to command attention. "I came here yesterday as a customer, to see how this location operates firsthand. What I experienced was unacceptable. Disrespectful. And frankly, it goes against every value this company stands for. This isn't just my opinion, it's a fact." He paused, letting his words sink in before turning to address Sarah and the other employees who had gathered nearby. "To all of you," he said, his tone softening slightly, "I want to make one thing clear, this store exists because of our customers. Every single person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with respect and professionalism, regardless of how they look or what they're wearing. That's non-negotiable." Sarah nodded quickly, her relief palpable. "Yes, Mr. Bennett," she murmured. "Absolutely." John turned back to Richard, whose face had gone pale. "As for you," he said, his voice cold and final, "consider this your last warning. If I hear even a whisper of this kind of behavior happening again, you'll be leaving this company, not just this store. Do I make myself clear?" Richard swallowed hard, his usual bravado completely shattered. "Crystal," he managed to choke out. Satisfied, John gave a curt nod. "Good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." With that, he strode past Richard, his presence radiating authority and purpose. As he exited the store, the chime above the door rang softly once more, signaling not just his departure, but the beginning of a much-needed transformation. I observed the scene intently before the associate could respond. Richard approached, his expression stern and unyielding. "Is there an issue here?" he inquired, directing his question pointedly at the associate rather than John. "No problem," John interjected calmly, stepping forward with quiet assurance. "I was simply asking about this necklace. I'd like to examine it further." Richard's eyes flared with irritation, thinly veiled beneath a mask of condescension. "That won't be necessary," he replied curtly. "As I mentioned earlier, we have other pieces that might better suit your preferences." John stood firm, refusing to be dismissed so easily. His gaze remained steady as he responded, "I'm interested in this one. I'd like to see how it looks." With growing impatience, Richard crossed his arms over his chest. "Our policy is clear," he said sharply. "Pieces like this are reserved for customers who are serious about purchasing. We can't allow just anyone to handle our most valuable items." For a moment, John's calm facade faltered, revealing a flicker of frustration. "And what makes you assume I'm not serious?" he challenged. Richard scanned John from head to toe, his sneer unmistakable. "Experience," he said coldly. "It's my job to know who can afford what, and to protect the integrity of this store and its brand. We uphold a certain reputation." John felt his temper simmer but kept his voice measured. "So, you uphold that reputation by judging people based on appearances? By turning away service because you've decided they don't belong?" Richard's face remained impassive. "It's not personal, it's business. Our clientele expects exclusivity. I can't waste time on those who aren't genuine buyers." John leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a deliberate tone. "How many potential buyers have you turned away because of assumptions like these? How many individuals have you disrespected because they didn't fit your narrow definition of a customer?" Richard's jaw tightened, his composure beginning to crack. "I run this store the way I see fit," he snapped. "Frankly, I don't owe you any explanations." John held Richard's gaze, anger simmering just beneath his composed exterior. "You may not owe me an explanation," he said quietly but firmly, "but someone will hold you accountable. This kind of treatment isn't only bad for business, it's morally wrong." For a fleeting moment, uncertainty flickered across Richard's features, but it quickly hardened into defiance. "If you don't approve of how things are done here, feel free to leave," he dismissed with a wave of his hand. "There are plenty of other stores that might cater to your tastes." John exhaled deeply, stepping back. He glanced at Sarah, the associate, whose worried expression mirrored the tension in the room. Turning back to Richard, he said coolly, "Thank you for your time. Rest assured, I'll make sure the right people hear about how you operate this establishment." With that, John pivoted on his heel and strode out of the store. The chime of the door seemed to echo louder than ever as he stepped back onto the bustling street. John knew exactly what needed to happen next. What he had witnessed wasn't an isolated incident, it was symptomatic of a deeper mindset, a philosophy entrenched within the culture of the business. As he walked away, his resolve solidified. Change was inevitable, and it would begin at the top. That night, John prepared meticulously for what lay ahead. The following morning, instead of returning to the luxury boutique, he headed straight to his company's headquarters, a sleek glass tower nestled in Midtown Manhattan. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet efficiency, phones rang softly, employees moved purposefully through the halls, and sunlight streamed through expansive windows. John entered the executive conference room, a spacious area dominated by a long polished table and floor-to-ceiling views of the city skyline. Taking a seat at the head of the table, he exuded calm determination. He had summoned Richard Coleman under the pretense of discussing store performance and future goals, a ruse designed to ensure Richard's attendance. Lisa, John's assistant, stood by the door, awaiting Richard's arrival. Moments later, Richard strode into the room, his usual air of confidence draped around him like a well-tailored suit. Dressed impeccably, his face bore a mix of curiosity and mild annoyance, clearly expecting nothing more than a routine meeting, or perhaps even praise for his management skills. His confident stride faltered slightly when he spotted John seated at the head of the table. Surprise registered in his widened eyes as he glanced between Lisa and John, struggling to place the man before him. Confusion flickered across his face. John allowed the silence to linger for a beat, letting the weight of the situation settle. Then, in a calm yet commanding voice, he spoke. "Take a seat, Richard," he instructed, gesturing to a chair opposite him. Richard hesitated briefly before pulling out a chair and sitting down. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," he began cautiously. "I wasn't expecting to see you here. Is everything all right?" John leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "No, Richard, everything is not all right. I'm here to address some serious concerns regarding your behavior at the store." Confusion clouded Richard's expression, followed by a fleeting attempt to regain his usual bravado. "Concerns? About what?" "I've been managing the store the same way I always have. Sales are up, and the brand image is stronger than ever. If there's an issue, I'd appreciate clarity." John's voice remained steady, each word carrying the weight of authority. "The issue isn't sales or branding. It's respect, for customers, for employees, and for the values this company claims to stand for. And today, we're going to discuss why that matters."